It's great to have a chance to present some of my work to your group and anybody else who's called in. So yeah, so the title of my talk is on the role of philosophy for the science of explainable AI. So I'll start by motivating why it is I'm interested in this question. So if you look at the literature on AI ethics, one of the most commonly discussed topics is this problem of transparency or explainability or interpretability, or a number of related terms, but explainability and interpretability are probably the most commonly used ones. So this is a study that came out a few years ago where they surveyed policy documents that have been put out. And so as you can see, they surveyed 84 documents, and in 73 of those 84 documents, they found some kind of principle or concern relating to transparency. And this trend has continued. So this is another report that came out last year, this time published by the WHO. So they're providing guidance for artificial intelligence in health. And again, they list a number of principles. And one of the principles they list is that you should ensure transparency, explainability, and intelligibility of the AI systems that you use for health. And so one of the things they say is that AI technologies should be explainable to the extent possible and according to the capacity of those to whom the explanation is directed. So this is just to illustrate that in the world of policymaking, and sort of both sort of formal policymaking within governments, but also more informal regulation and guidance from organizations like the WHO, this problem of transparency is quite prominent and is something that just pops up all the time. This has in turn motivated computer scientists to try and find solutions to the problem of transparency. I've just on this slide put up some examples of what people have tried to do. So basically, in various ways, people are trying to create technical tools that can help you make your AI system in some sense or another be more explainable or easier to understand. So there are some people who are trying to create ways of visualizing the hidden layers of a neural network. So that's the picture on the left of the screen. So you should be able to see that the thing with the gray thing, the things that are picked out should sort of correspond to the important features of the pictures on the right. So you might be able to see that in the bottom right corner, that should look like eyes, what it's picking out. So the idea is that by having this visualization of what the most important features of these different hidden layers are, that should give you some confidence that it's picking up on the right features of the images that it's classifying. On the right-hand side, that's a different technique. So here it's highlighting features of the input picture. So it's basically highlighting those features of the input picture that made the biggest difference. Again, that should give you some sense, maybe, of whether of why it made a different given classification. And you've got techniques that involve giving you counterfactuals. So if you had been 5 years older, you would have gotten the loan. And you've also got methods that are trying to build models that are simple by design, or in some sense intelligible by design. So rather than giving these kind of post hoc explanations, the idea is you constrain the machine learning process in a certain way, such that you can guarantee that it produces something that's easier to understand. And there's a debate within the machine learning community about the extent to which you can still achieve high performance on machine learning models whilst constraining it in this way. Some people think that's you can get very close to high performance. Some people think there's a trade-off, a more serious trade-off there. Okay, so that's some of the technical work that's going on. And this is just a small slice of it. There's tons of this kind of work, really a booming field in technical computer science. And it's not just something that's going on within academic research. These explainable AI techniques, as it's often called, are also being deployed and marketed by a lot of the big AI companies and technology companies. So there are either deploying it within their own systems, in the case of Facebook, or they are making it available for people to use in the case of Google, and there's an example here that's being marketed on Amazon Web Services. So these are all tools that are using some of the techniques I showed you on the previous slide, and they're supposed to be something you could implement when you develop an AI system or a model in order to make that system more explainable, and that's supposed to make the system more ethical or more trustworthy in some sense. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of what's going on in sort of the world of policy, technology, research at the moment. Now, looking at all of this research, you might wonder to yourself, okay, so what does explainability mean? Why is it that it's supposed to be so important? How do we know whether we're giving a good explanation? And these are really good questions. And they're in fact questions that are also being asked within the research community itself. And people don't necessarily have a great answer yet. So people like Zachary Lipton is very critical. He really thinks that that just isn't a very rigorous sense of explainability, and all of these different tools don't really achieve much. Other people are a bit more optimistic, think that it's just a matter of making the science of creating these systems more rigorous, and then maybe we'll be able to create AI systems that are explainable in a more robust sense. So to summarize here, you have this problem that there's a huge push towards creating explainable AI, or XAI as it's often abbreviated. But so far, most of the research you're finding out here is based on researchers' intuitive sense of what counts as interpretable or explainable. And that's a problem insofar as it just means that these techniques aren't very rigorous, and it's hard to know what distinguishes a good one from a bad one. There are also some more concrete problems. So one worry is that just because so many different methods are being produced, there's a worry that a given company will just pick whichever method sort of fits their interests best. So if we don't have any sense of deciding what the best method is for a given use case, then it becomes very easy for technology developers and deployers just to pick whichever method they think works best for them, given their own interests, rather than necessarily the method that gives the best explanation to the user or whoever should be receiving that explanation. And finally, there's this more general problem of just how do we actually design and assess the adequacy of explainable AI methods in a more rigorous way. So those are some of the problems, as I said, that are being raised within AI research itself, but it's also something that philosophers have increasingly started to try and contribute to. So what I want to do in the rest of this talk is I'm first going to look at some of the different approaches you find out there to making explainable AI more rigorous. I'm going to distinguish two general approaches. One of them is what I call a top-down approach to explainable AI, so where you take some existing theory of what a good explanation is, and then you try and apply that to the case of explainable AI. And then there are bottom-up approaches, which are more driven by empirical methods for directly measuring whether people find an explanation satisfying or whether they do gain a better understanding. And I'm going to survey both of those, sort of some of the work that's going on there. I think there's lots of good stuff there, but I'm also going to highlight some limitation. Then I'll introduce you to a pragmatist framework that I've been developing for thinking about the question of explainable AI, which I think helps not necessarily resolve those problems, but I think it helps us chart a way forward, which I think and it's a solution based on developing what I call mid-level theories of explainability. That's what I'm going to show you last. All right. So top-down approaches. As I said, the idea here is to take some existing model of explanation, often one that you can find from philosophy, in some cases models from cognitive psychology, where there's also some interesting work. So you take some existing model and then you apply it to the context of an AI system making decisions. So here are some of the examples you can find in the recent literature. For instance, Carlos Setnik has, so he's using David Marr's levels of explanation and some of the work on mechanistic explanations that you find in philosophy of cognitive science. So the idea is that you can have explanations. So he distinguishes a number of different questions you can ask that you can try and that can be explanatory questions. So they can be some is what is the system doing? So that's basically at the top level of this picture, what is the function that the system is implementing from input to output? So that's sort of focusing on the system itself. You can also explain why the system is working the way it is. So that's about explaining why is implementing this function a good way of tracking whichever correlation out in the real world that you're interested in. And you can also ask, how is it doing it? And that's about breaking down the mechanisms that are responsible for these things. So that's one example. So using sort of mechanistic explanation and the levels of explanation. Here's another paper that Erasmus, Bronner, and Fisher have put out. Again, they're using sort of the classical methods of explanations from philosophy of science. So deductive nomenological, inductive statistical, causal mechanical, and new mechanistic explanations. And again, so their framework is all about showing how different kinds of explainable AI techniques approximate these different models of explanation. And this is an example, finally, of a computer scientist who wrote this survey paper where he surveyed a large chunk of philosophy and psychology of explanation. So this was a computer scientist who wanted to look at what philosophers have said in order to create better explainable AI methods. And so he ends up picking this model that we find from Overton. And again, the idea is to try and show why different explainable AI techniques, to what extent do they approximate these existing models, and can we get any kind of input for how to do better from these models. So in general, I think this work is all very promising and interesting, but there are some limitations to it that I don't really think has been adequately addressed so far. And the main one is what I call the problem of explanatory pluralism. So within philosophy of science, and maybe the past couple of decades, most philosophers have come to think that explanation is pretty context dependent. So there are many different kinds of explanations you can give, and it really depends on the type of thing you're trying to explain and the kind of epistemic interests you have in a different context, what a good explanation is. So here's just one example from philosophy of biology. So if you ask yourself, why is the cheetah able to catch a gazelle? You want to explain that phenomenon. There are many different kinds of explanations that you can find in biology. You can look at physiological explanations. So you explain how the muscle structure of the cheetah's body enables it to reach those very high speeds that's necessary to catch the gazelle. There are also ecological explanations where you would say how, well, on the African savanna, is a certain ecological niche for a very fast predator, and that explains why something like the cheetah would have evolved. There are phylogenetic evolutionary explanations where you track the history of the evolution of the big cats in Africa and how a particular evolutionary path led to the emergence of the cheetah. And finally, there could be molecular genetic explanations where you explain why the genes of the cheetah gives rise to this kind of animal. And so these are all valid explanations. They're in various ways good explanations, but what counts as the most relevant one really depends on your explanatory interests. Different scientific fields focus on different interests, and it really depends on the context which one would be the most appropriate one to give when asked, why is the cheetah able to catch the gazelle? So that's an insight from philosophy of science, and it raises some questions for this top-down approach. The first one being, how do we pick the right explanatory model for the right context. So that's a problem we already have in philosophy of science. So in philosophy of science, most people would just look at what scientists in fact are using in a given domain and then start from that. So, we don't have to explain we don't have to necessarily decide whether mechanistic explanations are the right explanations for cognitive science. To a large extent, that's sort of given by the fact that those are the explanations that cognitive science are already mainly using. But in the case of explainable AI, there is no consensus we can defer to yet. So that makes it harder for us to know how do we pick the right model. And then there's a different problem, which is that the kind of explanatory models that philosophers, especially philosophers of science, have developed, they're usually developed with a focus on scientific contexts. And it's not obvious that the kind of epistemic interest that scientists have are actually the same ones that we should prioritize if we want to address some of the ethical concerns that are driving a lot of the worries about explainable AI. So at least we need to have some kind of answer to why should we take a model that was designed for scientific context and think that's the right one to use in the case of explainable AI. Okay. Yeah, so that's what I had to say. Those are the big problems I see for the top-down approaches. And now move on to the bottom-up approaches. So these are approaches where you try to find some kind of empirical measure to decide whether you've given a good explanation. And you can distinguish three strategies that people have pursued. I should say this is a more common strategy within computer science. It's not so much philosophers proposing this one. So one is just use user evaluation. So basically ask your users some representative sample of the users you imagine would be using a given system. And then you just give them a questionnaire and ask them if they think that the system is giving them good explanations or whether they feel like they understand the system better after you've given them some kind of explanation. So you showed them a counterfactual. You would have been given the loan if you had been 5 years older. And then the questionnaire asks you, before and after, or maybe with a control group, do you feel like you understand the system better? And if people say yes, then that's some evidence that you're giving them a good explanation. Another strategy is to use some domain general tasks. So maybe you'll, rather than asking your users, you'll ask them to do some kind of counterfactual reasoning about the model, or you'll ask them to try and predict, for a given input, what do you think the model will output, to see whether they have understanding of the model. And finally, you might also test something. So that's a domain general task, but you might also test a more domain specific task. So if it's a model deployed to aid a physician in their clinical reasoning, you could try just to test whether the physicians actually make better decisions when the system is when the predictions of the system are supplemented by some kind of explanation. So that's a domain specific task, say diagnosing accurately. So here is an example of people trying to use this bottom-up approach. So this is from DARPA's recent program on explainable AI. They, as you can see on the right-hand side, they do use all of these different models, in fact. Different ways that they're trying to measure whether explanations are effective. Okay, so here are some of the limitations I see to this approach. And I should say again, I think this is all good work. So these are not supposed to be sort of knockdown objections or anything like that. They're more, when I say limitations, I do mean that they're just issues that haven't been addressed yet, or things that could be done, things that haven't, limitations to an otherwise promising approach. Okay, so the first issue I see, when you focus on user evaluation, my worry is that people's sense of understanding isn't a very good measure of how good an explanation is. So this is something that's been studied quite extensively in cognitive psychology. It basically turns out that it's laughably easy to make people feel like they understand something that they don't actually understand. So here are just a few different examples of the kinds of studies that have been made. So there's an old study from 1978 where they had, so this was, the study basically went to a public library and they had experimenters stand in queue to use the photocopying machine, back when you had to go to the library to use a photocopier. And then the experimenter would try and jump the queue by giving some kind of excuse to the next person standing in line. And so they tested 3 conditions. One where they gave a meaningful explanation, such as, can I use the photocopier because I'm late to a meeting? Then they had a condition where they just didn't give any explanation. So they just said, can I use the photocopier machine? And then they tested a condition where they gave them an empty explanation, an explanation that was completely, that didn't contain any new information. So just said, can I use the photocopying machine because I need to use it? So it turns out that as long as you say because and then say something, people were much more willing to let you jump the queue. The only meaningful difference was the only significant difference in this experiment was between the condition where people didn't give any explanation at all and just asked to jump the queue. But apparently, what kind of explanation you gave didn't seem to make much of a difference to whether the experimenters were allowed to jump the queue. Another interesting case is the case of neurophilia, as J.D. Trout calls it. So basically, it turns out that one of the easiest ways to make people feel like they understand something is to add some neuropsychology on the side. So a neuropsychological piece of information that has nothing to do, no explanatory relevance to the thing you're trying to explain. But if you just sort of supplement the real explanation with a little bit of neuropsychological terminology on the side, people are much more willing to afterwards say that they feel like they understand it. So anyway, so this is a psychological literature that shows that it's pretty easy to manipulate people's sense of understanding, and people's self-report of how well they understand something is not a very reliable indicator of whether they in fact understand it and whether you have in fact given them a good explanation. So that's a limitation for using user evaluations. So you might think that's less problematic if you're testing their performance on tasks, and I would agree. But then we come back to the problem of explanatory pluralism that I asked earlier. So, okay, so if you're going to test some kind of domain general tasks, you still need to have some kind of account of what are the relevant tasks that you want people to be able to perform. And again, drawing on the philosophy of science lesson with explanatory pluralism, I'm just not sure there's going to be any particular set of tasks that are always going to be good indicators of the kind of understanding you need in particular contexts. And even if the same kinds of tasks or same kinds of skills are always going to be there, how they're being weighted, I suspect is going to differ quite a lot. So we still need some kind of account of how do you find the right tasks and how do you find the right weighting between them if you're trying to decide whether you're giving a good explanation. And finally, when we're talking about domain-specific tasks, so there it might be less worrying about pluralism, but then I would start worrying about fragmentation. So if we can just test whether a given type of explanation makes doctors better at doing their inferential tasks, that doesn't necessarily give us any evidence of whether the same type of explanation would also be useful, say, for a regulator who has to decide whether an automated vehicle, whether it was designers of an automated vehicle that are responsible for a crash. So if you're sort of trying to compare explanations between contexts, if you're trying to generalize your explainable AI methods, so you might be able to have some tools and you want to know whether they're good in general. If you're relying on domain-specific tasks, it's not obvious that that's going to give you a good explanation to those questions, even if it might allow you to design methods that are good for a specific use case. So those are some of the limitations I see to the bottom-up approaches. Okay, so to try and make some progress here, I want to draw on some ideas from philosophy of science that I at least think has been helpful for me to think about explainable AI. So the first idea I'm going to draw on is a view about what an explanation is. So when we talk about something, explaining something, so the verb explains, people have noticed that there are actually at least three different kinds of things that can be used as the subject for that verb. So in some cases, it's a phenomenon in the world that are doing the explaining. So the cold explains his sore throat. In some cases, it's some kind of theory or some kind of explanation, some kind of representation that is doing the explanation. So for instance, the germ theory explains infections. And in some cases, it's an agent, a human, who's doing the explanation. So the doctor explains how the vaccine works. So philosophers of science would generally say that these are all sort of licit uses of the verb explains, but what they disagree about is which of these uses should be taken as the primary one, which one is sort of capturing the core meaning of the word, and which of them, or of the concept, and which of them should be taken in some sense as a derivative notion. So people subscribing to what's called the Untitled view of explanation would say, well, explanations are, in the first instance, facts in the world, and then a representation is a good explanation to the extent that it accurately captures those facts in the world, and then humans give good explanations when they accurately communicate those representations. So that's the Untitled view. On an epistemic view, you take the representations to be the primary phenomenon. So good explanations are, in the first instance, representations that serve certain epistemic functions. And then the bits of the world that count as explanations, they're just the things that are being represented by good explanations in the sense of representations. And good communications are communications that manage to communicate those representations in a good way. And finally, on a communicative view, you start from the speech acts, the notion of explanations as being something that humans do, communicative acts, and then the good representations are those that serve those communicative acts well, and the things in the world that count explanations are just the ones that are being captured by the representations, and so on. So what I'm going to use for my purposes here is the communicative view. And specifically, I'm going to rely on a view along the following lines. So for my purposes, I'm going to say that an explanation is, in the first instance, a communicative act where an explainer conveys some information to an audience in order for the audience to obtain a better understanding of that phenomenon, of that explanatory target. So the idea here is that explanations are, in the first instance, communicative acts, or you might call them speech acts. And what makes that a good explanation? So that's the communicative bit. And then it also packs in a particular view of what is then the function of that communicative act. And that is to give the audience a better understanding of the explanatory target. So good explanations are those that succeed in giving the audience a better understanding. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't use explanations for other things. You can use explanations to mislead or to even to deceive, but those are in some sense parasitic on the primary use. So just like assertion, you can assert things in order to lie and deceive, but that's still, that use of the speech act of assertion is parasitic on the canonical use of assertion, namely to state truthful information. In the same way, you're only able to use explanations to deceive because you assume that the normal usage of the word, of the speech act, is to give people better understanding. Okay, so then this of course puts a lot of the analytical focus on the notion of understanding. So in order to get something more substantive out of this kind of view, you then have to combine it with a view of understanding. And here again, if you look at the literature of understanding, again, you can sort of divide it into three broad categories. people who think that there's some theories of understanding which focus on what's called explanatory understanding. So those are ones where they claim that to understand something is to grasp an accurate explanation. And so here explanation is usually meant in the sense of a representation or perhaps an unchecked fact in the world. Then there's objectual understanding, where to understand something is to have some kind of coherent, well-connected set of beliefs. And finally, that's practical understanding. So where understanding consists in inferential and practical know-how. And again, I think most philosophers of understanding would say that these are all types of understanding, but there's basically, again, the debate is mainly about which of these should be considered the primary ones. Can they be reduced to each other in some sense? And for my purposes, I'm going to go with the practical understanding view, and that's going to be my focus. So specifically, I'm going to rely on these two ideas. So first, inferentialism. So this is a view of what understanding consists of. So I'm going to assume that to understand something, your understanding of something consists of your ability to competently draw inferences about that thing. And I'm going to combine that with a contextualist view of understanding ascriptions. So the view is that ascriptions of understanding are accurate to the extent that the subject of that ascription possesses the kinds of understanding that are salient in the context of ascription. So the idea is that, and if you combine these two views, you basically get a view that says to understand something is to have, understanding ascriptions are accurate to the extent that the subject possesses the kinds of inferential abilities that are going to be salient in that context. So just to give you an example, if I say, I understand how my fridge works, I might have in mind a certain kind of inferential abilities that are related to being able to repair the fridge. Now I'm messing up the example, that are relevant to be able to keeping my food cold. So if I say I understand my fridge, I might just have that set of abilities in mind. However, if the fridge breaks and I then say, oh, I don't understand how this fridge works, but Jill does, I wish Jill was here, she understands this fridge, then I'm shifting the kinds of abilities that are salient to be focusing on ones that are relevant to being able to repair the fridge. And so in that new speech context, I no longer count as understanding it, but now Jill does. Okay, so we've put all of these components together. We get a view of what accounts for something to be explainable that looks a little bit like this. And, you can see below the paper where I defend this view with my co-author, Diana Robinson. So the view is that for something to be explainable by some explainer to an audience in a given context, it's explainable to the extent that the explainer is able to convey information to the audience, which improves the audience's ability to draw inferences about the explanatory target that are needed to achieve the purposes that are salient in the context. So this is sort of a template for what it means to be explainable, and I think it has the virtue that it is context sensitive enough that you can capture a lot of the pluralism that I highlighted, but at the same time, there is sort of a general or unified notion underlying that plurality that we can use to derive some real guidance still. I'm going to just highlight how this helps us solve some of the problems I showed earlier. So first, we get a way of navigating the explanatory pluralism because claims of explainability are now going to be linked to contextual purposes. So once you've decided what the contextual purpose is, you can then work your way backwards to figure out what kinds of abilities are needed to serve that purpose. And then you can ask what kind of information do you need to give to the audience in order for them to have those abilities. And then that will help you decide what kinds of explanations will help the audience achieve that information or grasp that information. Next, the problem of the unreliability of understanding. This framework has the virtue that it links understanding closely to abilities. So it gives you a notion of explainability where you don't have to rely on subjective reports of whether you understand something. It is just, tied closely to ability. But at the same time, it overcomes the problem of, or it helps with the problem of fragmentation, because we still have this underlying unified framework that allows us to think more systematically about, even if we need some more context-specific notions of explainability, we can still start thinking about the extent to which they generalize. So if there is a given set of purposes, you can start asking yourself, well, in what contexts or in what use cases will those be the relevant purposes? You could even start thinking about maybe a hierarchy of different notions of explainability, where some of them generalize more and some of them are more context-specific. So that's the framework that I've been developing. So in order to make some, to apply this framework to a given domain, I think there's certain kinds of questions you can ask yourself, the sort of heuristic questions. You can start by asking yourself, what kind of purposes should we prioritize in a given domain? Then who needs to be able to do what in order to achieve those purposes? Then we can ask what kind of information that this audience need in order to obtain those abilities. So what is it that they aren't able to do now that the explanation should enable them to do? And finally, what is the best way to communicate that information? And what's important to notice here is that many of these questions, they're not purely empirical or purely normative. They sort of sit somewhere in between being value-laden and empirical at the same time. And that's going to be an important point for the last bit of my talk that I'm coming to now. So the question is, given this view of explainability that I've outlined here, what then is the role of philosophy? Is the role of the philosopher done now that I've given this general framework, and now we hand it over to the computer scientists and engineers working on explainable AI, and philosophers can start worrying about other things? I don't think so. I think there's more work for us to do here, but it does going to look a little bit different from the kind of top-down approaches that I showed you to begin with. So I take a lot of inspiration here from the relationship between philosophy and science that Anna Alexandrova has outlined in her book on the philosophy for the Science of Well-being. So in this book, Anna does many interesting things, but one of them is that she argues against the traditional model of the philosophy of well-being, where you have what she calls a vending machine view. So you take the traditional views of well-being, such as a hedonic view or an objective list view, and then you just apply it to the given domain. And instead, she thinks we need to have a more pragmatic view of the relationship between the two. And I think a very similar model can be applied to the case of explainable AI. So here is what she means by the vending machine view. I should say, by the way, the distinction between vending machine and toolbox is in turn one that Alexandrova borrows from Nancy Cartwright's view of laws of nature. So I guess that's a tradition of borrowing this metaphor that I'm continuing here. But so the vending machine view is basically sort of fairly straightforward. You take your ideal high theory notion of, say, what well-being is or what a good explanation is, then you input some domain-specific information. So, in the case of a scientific law, that could be what's usually called the initial conditions. In the case of a theory of well-being, that could be some facts about, say, suppose you choose a hedonic view of well-being, then you input some empirical facts about what makes people feel pleasure in a given context. In the case of explanation, you input some facts about the relevant domain that will pick out what a good explanation looks like in that domain. You put those things together, and you should just almost like a vending machine, output a theory of what counts as a good explanation for that context. The toolbox view takes a more complex view of what the relationship here is there. So the idea is that rather than high theory just giving you directly a theory of explainability, instead it should serve as inspiration for mid-level theories. And so in the case of well-being, Anna, for example, thinks that all of the classical theories of well-being have some insights that will usually be relevant to spelling out what's a relevant notion of well-being in a particular context. So, for instance, for what does it mean to have well-being as a child? There are elements of both objectivist and subjective well-being and preference satisfaction that is going to be relevant. But exactly what kinds of relevance they're going to have is going to vary by domain. And she doesn't think that there's any sort of a priori way that you can work that out. Instead, you need to do the hard work of going in and combining sort of with an inspiration from the high theory views, combine that with domain-specific knowledge about what's it like to be a child and what kinds of things tend to make children happy, but also some domain-specific value judgments. For instance, what is a good life for a child? There's some combination on the one hand of enjoying childhood, but of course childhood is also something that's important for becoming an adult. And so you need to make some value judgments about the extent to which you should weigh those different things that are constitutive of being a child when designing your mid-level theory. And then once you've designed that mid-level theory, you can then use that as justification for more specific operationalized ways of measuring, in the one case, well-being, and the other case, explainability. So this is the kind of view. This is really where I think the new role for philosophy for explainable AI can do some work. It can basically serve the same kind of role that philosophy does in Anna's theory of well-being to help create these mid-level theories. So this is the positive program I see for philosophy in relationship to explainable AI going forwards. It should contribute to developing these mid-level theories of explainability. And I think philosophers are well placed to contribute to this project for a couple of reasons. First, as I've emphasized, normative value judgments are going to be important here. And I think sort of philosophical normative analysis of what matters for different domains is going to be important to figuring out what a good explanation is. But it's going to be slightly different kinds of normative analyses. It's not necessarily going to focus on the norms for good explanations directly, but more indirectly look at what kinds of purposes are important to serve, in particular contexts, and then use that to inform work on what counts as good explanation. I still think there is a role for these more traditional high theory views, but as I've said, it's going to be more a case of adapting and maybe modifying, finding inspiration for what explanations look like in a given domain. And again, philosophers, in particular philosophers of science, have good knowledge of what those classical high theory models are, so they will still be helpful in adapting those in the right way. And finally, there is collaboration to be done with empirical scientists and technical researchers to integrate these different kinds of knowledge into workable mid-level theories. And again, in my experience, philosophers tend to be, at least philosophers trained in philosophy of science and other sort of disciplines that have a connection to sciences, philosophers tend to be quite good at making those collaborations work. In my experience, we're quite good at communicating between different traditions in that way. So I think there's another sort of mediating collaboration role for us to play as well. So here's just my final slide, sort of maybe in an image, what I think this project can look like going forward. So it's going to be some kind of collaboration between normative research, technical research, and social science research. So to give an example of something that I'm hoping to work on going forward, so one use case is automated predictions of legal cases for self-represented individuals, so individuals who are unable to afford legal representation, so have to represent themselves in court. If you want to give them predictions and you want to give them some kind of plain English explanation of what those predictions for the outcome of the case is, there are a couple of different questions that you need to answer. So some of them is going to be normative in nature. Basically, what exactly is it that will be helpful for self-represented individuals to do? What do they need to be able to do in order to navigate the legal system, at least navigate it better than they're able to at present? So that's a normative question. But there are also technical questions. What kinds of explanations can we actually generate given current technical methods? And that should constrain or at least inform what kinds of explanations we propose will work well in this domain. And finally, we should, of course, inform this by social science research, by psychologists or human computer interaction people or people from design about, well, what do people actually infer when they're being given these plain English explanations. And I think all of these types of information will constrain each other and hopefully help us articulate what a good explanation for that use case would be. So that's an overview of what I've done so far and what I hope to do in the future. And